So I want to talk about communion, the Eucharist, taking of the bread and the wine in memory of Jesus' death and resurrection. I kind of want to do this in the context of going through the narrative and the story of the last moments of Jesus' life leading up to his death and sort of the events surrounding that. And kind of looking at it as a story, because I was asking advice about how to speak on these things, and somebody told me, you got to tell stories. And I thought about that a lot, and I think it's pretty good advice. Stories are good. They have a beginning, middle, end. They have some kind of lesson. They're usually memorable. That was the point the person was making, is that when you tell stories, it's automatically more memorable for people, because we just engage really well with stories, and I think that's a powerful thing. But the problem with that, for me, is I don't really have a whole lot of stories. I don't have this stack of anecdotes that I can just pull out and tell funny stories and make my point that way. I feel like I kind of struggle with that a little bit. So I think that can actually resound to my benefit, because I'm not going to tell a story about me. I'm going to tell a story about Jesus. And the Bible is full of really, really awesome stories. And I think that if we think about it that way, it will be automatically more memorable for us. So let's dive in here to the story of communion. And I think actually before we start reading, one other point I want to make is the benefit of physical traditions. And I think this is something that Catholicism really gets right. It's the acting out of something that has an invisible spiritual component. So the physical taking of the bread and the wine is the entire point of communion. It's an act of worship. It's an act of remembrance. What does that really mean? And what are we really taking into ourselves when we perform this ritual? And I call it a ritual intentionally because it's a religious ritual, which sounds a little gross and weird to our modern sensibilities, but that really is what it is. It's a religious ritual that we still continue to do to this day. Catholics do it, Protestants do it, non-denominational types, most people who profess Christianity also profess the value of that, even if they can't really articulate it all that well sometimes. So, into the story. It begins 2 days before Passover, Matthew chapter 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he was telling some other parables before this, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. So that's our introduction. That Jesus is preparing for this meal, and the priests are a-scheming, and there's fear of a riot. So moving on to this next anecdote, which is juxtaposed with this right after in the book of Matthew, is this instance where Jesus has this encounter with a woman while he's sitting at dinner, I believe the day before the Passover. So this is Matthew chapter 6, verse 6 through 13. And it's the story of excessive sacrifice. So it says, verse 6, while Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. And when the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." So this is a powerful, powerful prophecy. This woman's act of excessive sacrifice reflects Jesus' act of excessive sacrifice that will take place but a few days later. Excessive in sort of can be construed in a negative sense, right? So if someone lives in a huge house, they have such an excessive lifestyle, it's a single person and they live in this big place, or you order too much food, so you're excessive. And Jesus' sacrifice can be described in that way. Why does it have to be that way? Why does it have to be so aggressively described? Why does it have to be so dramatic and bloody and gory? Why did it have to be that way? And in the same way, the disciples asked this question, why have this excess of this beautiful thing, this beautiful perfume poured on Jesus? And Jesus is trying to communicate to the disciples that this woman's act, even though, just like communion, it's a physical act, but it's a reflection of a spiritual truth. She is exhibiting something that's beyond the actual act of what she's doing. She's prophesying Jesus' death. She's preparing him for burial. Jesus, his comment about the poor seems very un-Jesus. So the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. And it seems so antithetical to what Jesus has done up to this point, healing the sick, raising the dead, talking to all these, people on the streets. But what he's saying here is that even though he did do all of those things, he healed and raised the dead and did all of those things, he's trying to communicate to the disciples that that's not the plane that he's operating on, though. It's the difference between giving a homeless guy some spare change versus you see a homeless guy in the street about to get hit by a bus and you shove him out of the way and then you get hit by the bus instead. It's two totally different levels of sacrifice. And Jesus is trying to communicate to the disciples and everyone watching that he is not thinking on the same plane that they're thinking on. He is about to do something crazy, excessive. Crazy could be construed as wasteful in the same way that the woman does with this perfume. The grand finale, he came to top all the rest. And he didn't come to do it for the attention. He came to do it because he had to get all of our attention. So the next thing we're going to hop into is this extreme betrayal by Judas. So this is Matthew chapter 26, verse 14 that we're going to jump over to. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him," meaning Jesus, "over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. We're going to hop over and finish the Judas arc here. So verse 47, this is when Jesus is arrested. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him, a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged for a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Now, if that's not a good story, I don't know what is. Just imagine that as a movie scene. It sounds like something out of The Godfather. So why is this included in the story, this extreme betrayal? And I do want to skip over to the final point of Judas's arc, his death and suicide. So this is chapter 27, verse 1, just so we can finish out his story and then we'll talk about it. 27, verse 1. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. So, reading this, the question entered my mind, why did Judas have to die? And I don't mean why was he gripped with remorse and why did he decide to kill himself. I mean more so in a narrative sense. Why is the Judas character, why couldn't he have a redemptive arc? Why couldn't he see Jesus rise again and maybe be able to receive forgiveness for what he's done? It seems like that would have been a more powerful story than this abrupt and violent end that Judas finds. And this is juxtaposed here if we hop back just a couple verses to Peter disowning Jesus. So I want to read through that. Matthew chapter 26, 69 through 75. "Now Peter was sitting out in the crowd. A servant girl came to him. 'You were also with Jesus of Galilee,' she said. But he denied it before them all. 'I don't know what you're talking about,' he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, 'This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth.' He denied it again with an oath. 'I don't know the man.' After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the words he had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. And then this is followed up right by chapter 27, where Judas hangs himself. So they both commit similar sins. Judas obviously is different because his act directly results in the death of Jesus. But 1 John chapter 13, verse 15 tells us that anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. So it seems like God cares less about the results of sin than he does about the sin itself. So why is it that in this arc Judas has to die, but Peter goes on to be a disciple, write multiple books in the Bible, and is called St. Peter by millions to this day? Why does Peter get this redemptive arc while Judas has to die? Is it the degree of their sin? That doesn't seem like to really gel with the Christian tradition, which is no sin is too great, all sin is equal in the eyes of God, and all of this. So as I was thinking about this, the answer that I came to was the book of Luke and John. So Matthew and Mark don't include this, but the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John both state Satan entered Judas and the devil prompted Judas, respectively. So with this characterization, Judas represents in the narrative, and for us, the part of us that is available to be used by the devil himself to plot, to betray, and to kill. And that part of us has no place in the new covenant. I believe that this is what the Judas arc is demonstrating, is because when we are set free, we're set free of that aspect of sin, the slave aspect of sin. Paul writes about this really well in Corinthians, and that we can go over at a different time, but the slave aspect of sin that Judas represents is the part that has to be done away with. It has to be taken out. But what Peter did was, in a moment of weakness, a girl walked up to him, and in his fear, he gets very emotional. He's yelling, he's cursing. He's so desperate to preserve his own life that he sins 3 times over and denies Jesus similarly, and betrays Jesus similar to how Judas betrays Jesus, but he does it in a moment of weakness. And those are the things that all Christians continually do, even after they receive salvation. So you're no longer a slave, you're no longer available to be used, but you are still going to sin just as Peter sinned. But again, Peter goes on to be a great apostle, to plant churches, to write books in the Bible, and is called St. Peter. He is redeemed, even though he had this moment of weakness. So that is a lesson of hope to all of us, and also a lesson, a warning to not allow ourselves to be used by the devil and do this premeditated act of evil. Judas sought out payment to be able to give up Jesus. He went and sought out sin, and that aspect of us is the part that has no place in the new covenant. So this sort of way of thinking about the story, this thinking about the narrative and what Judas and Peter represents, I think is the most powerful aspect of the stories that shape us, and demonstrates the power of narrative and the power of stories. The most memorable characters are the ones we're able to see ourselves in, and at some point in your life you have been or will be each of these characters, and that's the power of narrative. We've all been betrayed, and we've all been the betrayer. We've all lied, we've all pushed people away for self-preservation. It's all of these things that they're so emotive and they're so real for us still today. It's why these stories are so powerful. So moving on, Matthew chapter 27, verse 11 through 25. 2 more characters that I want to be able to think about in this way. So Jesus before Pilate, verse 11. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Do you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At this time they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked him, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who was called the Messiah?" For he knew that it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Find every great man is a great woman. Okay, whatever. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." And all the people answered, "His blood is on us and our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and then handed over to be crucified. So this character of Pilate, the man in power who, not by his action does he contribute to the death of Jesus, but by his inaction, he attempts to wash himself clean in a ceremonial act that in the end means nothing and for the salvation of his own soul. It's similar to how we act or when we're living in the world apart from God's grace. We can attempt to wash ourselves, but it's never adequate. Jesus' blood is still on Pilate, and history will look back on Pilate and believe that to be true. In the Christian tradition, Pilate is responsible for Jesus' death. Even though he did the symbolic washing of the hands, it was not enough. And insofar as we're looking at ourselves in these characters, someday you may find yourself with power, and you may be faced with the choice to act or not act. And in those moments when you have power, the Bible says that anyone in power is appointed by God, therefore respect authority. You can't wash your hands. Once you're in that position, your inaction is still action. You can't wash your hands of those things. And again, another characterization, between Pilate and the crowd. So the crowd is kind of its own character in the story. It effectively bullies Pilate into murdering Jesus. And it's very often that we find ourselves members of a crowd just on a sheer numbers game. I think we all like to think of ourselves as one of the good 11 apostles when we read through the Gospels, that we kind of want to see ourselves in those people, or in maybe one of the women who were traveling with Jesus as well, that we want to be, we were right next to Jesus, we were puttering around, as he was following and preaching. That's who we would have been in the story. But on a sheer numbers level, that's pretty unlikely. If you were alive in Jesus' day, there's a pretty good shot that you would have been a member of that crowd. Remember, the people who paid Judas to hand over Jesus were, by our standards, the pastors, the priests, the people you respect. Those were the ones that these people were on the side of in their minds. It's like if everyone you respect in your community, everyone you like in your community got together, your pastor, some people on the school board, maybe the mayor, everyone with power is telling you, hey, this guy is no good. He has this gaggle of people around him, and he's saying all these religiously sacrilege. He's doing all these acts of sacrilege. He's claiming to be God. This guy has to be taken out. That's who the crowd was on the side of. So even though we read this today and think of them as this unruly, evil mass, but in the end, that's us in this story. Every person is a sinner. Every person is a member of that crowd. We are the ones shouting, "Crucify him." There's a great quote by Jordan Peterson that says, if you were in Germany in the 1930s, you probably would have been a Nazi, just on a sheer probability, because most of the people, this isn't Jordan Peterson, this is me talking, on a sheer probability, because most of those people were just going along to get along. Otherwise, the party wouldn't have been in power if all these people were in an uproar against them. Most Germans were going along with this. the guards at Auschwitz are normal humans who were convinced to do something evil because of the crowd. The religious leaders took advantage of this, but they were also worried about a riot in the other direction. So these things happen when you have these masses. So are you actively weighing Jesus and Barbarous, or are you just yelling because everyone else is yelling? Are you thinking critically about what choices you're making, or are you just a member of the crowd? So we're going to quickly move on here to the death of Jesus. This is Matthew chapter 27, 50 through 54. And when Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. I love that wording. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city, and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." And then again, just a few verses later, 3 days later, Jesus rises from the dead. Matthew chapter 28, verse 1 through 10. After the Sabbath, at the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven again, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning. His clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." The woman hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped at his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." So that's it. We've hit all the big points. Jesus' preparation for death, Jesus' trial, betrayal, arrest, trial, death, and resurrection. So you'll notice that I kind of strategically skipped the actual communion passage. So I want to go back to it now because I think it's kind of beneficial to see it in this order. So the Last Supper, this is Matthew chapter 26, verse 20 through 30. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine from now until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So in this moment of communion, Jesus, in his very person, representing in this moment, but also with his whole life, he represents the tying up of all loose ends of the past and the future. The story of the Jewish people beginning with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that relationship between father and son. The story of the Jewish people with Moses, slavery, blood on doorways, the origin of the Passover feast. The very cup he raised represents redemption in the Jewish Passover, so it's the third of the fourth, represents redemption. He's connecting their story to our personal stories. He's connecting the story of the Jewish people to the story of the individual disciples who are sitting at that table. And in a time where it seems fashionable to take an axe to our own culture, it's important to remember that Jesus says, "I've come not to destroy but to fulfill." By his action, he's not taking out the future, but he's turning all of those things into arrows pointing to himself. The physical act of taking communion is an act of worship. It places us at that table with Jesus, reclining there with him, while he lays out God's story for us again and again, every time we take it, so that we'll never forget it. And that's what great stories do. They allow us to see ourselves in a way kind of like how God sees us. So if you're reading the Bible, if you're reading any book, any story, and you close it, you pause the movie, then you go back and you can pick it up anywhere in the story without regard to time. That's how God sees us. I believe that God has given us narrative as a gift. It's a way for us to see ourselves in character. It's a way to distill aspects of human nature and put us beyond time, allow us to see the story of the earth as God sees it. And the Bible is full of great stories, and in the spirit of communion and in the spirit of prayer that we've been pushing lately, it's two pillars. Any good Sunday school student knows. How do I learn more about God? Oh, you pray and you read your Bible. That's it. Those are the two things. You read and then you have to pray, and so that it's able to come to life for you, so that you're able to make sense of it. You have to read them. You have to read them. And that's the value of great stories. It's why we love movies. It's why we love novels, because it's all in that same spirit of giving us something that we can't get in our day-to-day lives. And it's an understanding of ourselves, and it's visualizing ourselves as these characters in these moments, so that we're able to understand ourselves better, and that we're able to further understand human nature and further understand God's will for our lives. So I encourage you, take communion, perform the acts, live it out. The act of reading, the act of meditating and prayer, and then the physical rituals, they all have to be tied together for us to make sense of our faith and for us to further understand God's will for our lives.